Picture a time 10,000 years ago when the final groups of woolly mammoths roamed Earth's northern reaches. These magnificent creatures, standing up to 11 feet tall at the shoulder, persisted through one of the most significant climate transitions in recent geological history. Their story of adaptation and survival offers a remarkable glimpse into life at the end of the Pleistocene epoch. As temperatures rose and the vast ice sheets retreated northward, most mammoth populations faced extinction. Yet one group found refuge on Wrangel Island, a remote Arctic landmass off the coast of what is now Siberia. These mammoths became separated from mainland populations as rising sea levels transformed the ancient land bridge into an ocean channel. The isolation created a unique sanctuary where these Ice Age giants continued to thrive for thousands of years after their mainland relatives disappeared. The Wrangel Island mammoths underwent physical changes to adapt to their new environment. Their bodies became smaller, a transformation scientists call island dwarfism, reducing from their original 11-foot height to approximately 6 to 7 feet tall. This size reduction allowed them to survive on the limited resources available on the island. Their tusks became shorter and their fur adapted to the changing climate patterns, though they maintained the thick woolly coat that had served their species through the Ice Age. These survivors developed distinct behavioral patterns that set them apart from their ancestral mainland populations. They'd formed smaller social groups and modified their feeding habits to accommodate the island's vegetation. The archaeological evidence suggests they became highly efficient at utilizing the limited plant species available, developing specialized grinding teeth patterns that reflected their adapted diet. The isolation on Wrangel Island created genetic changes within this population. DNA analysis reveals that these mammoths maintained a surprising level of genetic diversity for several thousand years, though they eventually experienced a decline in genetic variation. This reduction in genetic diversity played a role in their ultimate fate, making them more vulnerable to environmental changes and diseases. The mammoths of Wrangel Island persisted until approximately 4,000 years ago, making them the last known population of woolly mammoths on Earth. During their final years, they coexisted with the early Egyptian pyramids and the first Bronze Age civilizations. Their extinction coincided with a period of climate instability that brought warmer temperatures and changes in vegetation patterns to their island home. Recent studies of preserved mammoth remains from Wrangel Island have revealed fascinating details about their final years. Scientists have identified genetic mutations that affected their fat metabolism, coat texture, and social behaviors. These changes paint a picture of a population struggling to adapt to increasingly challenging conditions, from reduced food quality to potential reproductive complications. The story of these final mammoths provides valuable insights into how species respond to climate change and isolation. Their ability to persist for thousands of years on Wrangel Island demonstrates the remarkable adaptability of these Ice Age mammals. At the same time, their eventual extinction highlights the limits of adaptation and the complex interplay between genetics, environment, and survival. Archaeological evidence indicates that humans never established permanent settlements on Wrangel Island during the mammoths' tenure there. This absence of human hunters sets their extinction apart from many other megafaunal extinctions of the Pleistocene, where human hunting played a significant role. Instead, their disappearance appears linked to environmental factors and the genetic challenges of maintaining a small, isolated population. The preservation conditions on Wrangel Island have left scientists with exceptional mammoth specimens, including well-preserved DNA samples. These materials continue to yield new information about how these animals lived and adapted during their final millennia. Through advanced genetic analysis techniques, researchers can track changes in their population structure, health conditions, and evolutionary adaptations over time. The transition from the last Ice Age brought dramatic changes to Earth's climate, forcing many species to adapt or perish. A small population of woolly mammoths faced these environmental pressures on the fringes of an expanding desert region. Through natural selection spanning thousands of years, these mammals developed distinct physical characteristics that set them apart from their Ice Age ancestors. The most noticeable adaptation appeared in their fur. The thick, insulating coat that once protected against brutal cold transformed into a lighter, sparser covering. This thinner fur allowed better heat dissipation in the scorching desert temperatures. The color shifted from dark brown to a pale sandy tone, providing camouflage against the desert backdrop and reflecting more sunlight to regulate body temperature. Their feet underwent significant modifications to handle the unstable desert terrain. The once compact pads broadened, distributing weight more effectively across loose sand. This adaptation prevented sinking and reduced energy expenditure during movement across dunes. Their toes developed additional cushioning, protecting against the burning surface temperatures that could reach extreme levels during peak daylight hours. The desert mammoth's ears grew larger than those of their predecessors. These expanded appendages served as natural cooling systems, with an extensive network of blood vessels close to the skin surface. By increasing the surface area exposed to air, the animals could release excess body heat more efficiently. This biological radiator system proved critical for survival in their new environment. Their tusks became shorter and less curved compared to their Ice Age relatives. This modification reduced the energy cost of carrying heavy ivory in an environment where resources were scarce. The shorter tusks still maintained their utility for digging up roots and clearing paths to water sources, but required less calcium and energy to maintain. These mammals developed specialized digestive systems capable of processing desert vegetation with high efficiency. Their stomachs adapted to extract maximum moisture from tough, fibrous plants that other herbivores struggled to digest. This ability to process water-poor vegetation became a crucial survival advantage in their arid habitat. The desert mammoth's social structure shifted to accommodate their new environment. Groups became smaller, allowing more efficient use of limited resources. They developed patterns of movement that followed seasonal water sources, traveling longer distances between feeding grounds than their ancestors ever needed to cover. Their circadian rhythms adjusted to desert life, with most activity occurring during cooler night hours. During daylight, they sought shelter in the shadows of rock formations or gathered in groups to create shade for one another. This behavioral adaptation minimized exposure to extreme temperatures and reduced water loss through perspiration. The desert mammoth's reproductive cycle aligned with environmental conditions. Births coincided with brief seasonal rains when vegetation was most abundant. Calves developed faster than their Ice Age counterparts, reaching mobility quickly to keep pace with the moving herd. Their sensory capabilities enhanced to detect distant water sources. The trunk became more sensitive to subtle changes in air moisture and ground temperature, leading them to underground water reserves. This adaptation proved essential during prolonged dry periods when surface water disappeared entirely. The transformation from woolly mammoth to desert mammoth demonstrated nature's capacity for adaptation over generations. Each physical and behavioral modification represented a solution to specific environmental challenges. These changes accumulated gradually, producing a distinct species optimized for survival in one of Earth's most demanding ecosystems. Through this evolutionary process, the desert mammoths carved out a unique ecological niche. Their success in adapting to extreme environmental changes offered a blueprint for species survival during periods of significant climate transformation. The remnants of their woolly mammoth ancestry became barely recognizable as they evolved into a new form perfectly suited to their desert home. The mammoth populations that migrated into mountainous regions underwent significant biological adaptations to cope with the challenges of high-altitude environments. These changes occurred gradually over thousands of years through natural selection, producing distinct characteristics that set them apart from their lowland relatives. The most notable adaptation appeared in their respiratory system. Mountain mammoths developed larger lungs relative to their body size, increasing their capacity to process the thin air found at high elevations. Their blood composition changed too, with a higher concentration of red blood cells to carry oxygen more efficiently throughout their bodies. These modifications enabled them to thrive in areas where other large mammals struggled to survive. Their hearts grew more muscular to pump blood effectively against gravity and through the enhanced network of blood vessels that evolved to serve their oxygen-hungry tissues. The capillary density in their muscles increased, creating shorter distances for oxygen to travel from blood vessels to cells. This adaptation proved particularly beneficial during physical exertion, such as climbing steep terrain or foraging on mountainsides. The mountain mammoth's feet adapted to grip rocky surfaces. Their toe pads developed rougher textures with specialized grip patterns that prevented slipping on wet or icy rocks. Their leg muscles became more compact and powerful, optimized for ascending and descending steep gradients rather than covering long distances on flat ground. Their fur underwent modifications too, developing multiple distinct layers. The outer layer became more water-resistant to shed rain and snow, while the inner layers provided insulation against cold mountain winds. This multi-layered coat regulated their body temperature more effectively than the simpler fur of their lowland ancestors. These mammoths' diet shifted to include high-altitude vegetation. Their teeth developed sharper ridges to process the tough mountain plants, and their digestive systems became more efficient at extracting nutrients from this fibrous diet. They learned to consume a variety of plants that grew at different elevations, moving up and down the mountainsides with the changing seasons. Their social behavior adapted to mountain living as well. The herds became smaller, typically consisting of 5 to 10 individuals, as the terrain and available resources could not support larger groups. They developed more sophisticated communication methods to warn each other about hazards such as loose rocks or approaching predators, using low-frequency sounds that carried well in thin mountain air. The calves of mountain mammoths showed accelerated development of balance and coordination. Within days of birth, they could navigate steep paths and uneven terrain, a crucial adaptation for survival in their challenging habitat. Their bones grew denser than those of their lowland cousins, providing better support for climbing and reducing the risk of fractures from falls. These mammoths' trunks became more sensitive to changes in air pressure, serving as natural barometers. This sensitivity helped them anticipate weather changes and seek shelter before storms arrived. Their trunks also adapted to be more precise in grabbing onto rocks and vegetation for additional stability while moving through difficult terrain. The success of mountain mammoths demonstrated the remarkable adaptability of the species. Their populations established themselves across various mountain ranges, each group developing subtle variations based on their specific altitude and local conditions. These adaptations created distinct subgroups of mountain mammoths, each specialized for their particular elevation and terrain type. Research on fossilized remains indicates that mountain mammoths maintained stable populations for thousands of years, suggesting their adaptations were highly effective. Their bones show signs of regular physical stress from climbing, but also reveal robust healing capabilities, indicating they evolved to manage the daily demands of their mountainous habitat. The mountain mammoth story represents a fascinating example of how environmental pressures can shape a species. Their transformation from plains-dwelling giants to specialized mountain dwellers illustrates the power of natural selection in creating organisms perfectly suited to their environment. The forest-dwelling mammoths developed distinct adaptations that set them apart from their mountain and plains relatives. These specialized creatures modified their physical structure to access food sources in dense woodland environments. The most striking feature of forest mammoths was their elongated neck, which evolved through natural selection over thousands of generations. This adaptation allowed them to reach higher branches and access foliage that other herbivores could not. The neck vertebrae showed increased flexibility compared to other mammoth species, though not as extreme as modern giraffes. Their fur underwent significant changes from the thick, layered coats of their ancestors. The dense forest canopy created warmer, more stable temperatures than open plains or mountains, reducing the need for heavy insulation. The fur became thinner and developed a stripped pattern that broke up their silhouette among dappled forest light and shadows. This camouflage pattern helped them blend with the vertical lines of tree trunks and shifting sunlight through leaves. Forest mammoths modified their dental structure to process woody vegetation. Their molars developed sharper ridges suited for slicing through tough branches and stripping bark rather than grinding grass. The tooth enamel thickened to withstand the increased wear from fibrous plant material. Their tusks became shorter and more curved, serving as tools to pull down branches and strip bark from trees. The digestive system adapted to extract nutrients from leaves and bark rather than grasses. The stomach enlarged and developed specialized chambers to break down cellulose more efficiently. The intestinal tract lengthened to maximize nutrient absorption from woody plant matter. These internal modifications allowed forest mammoths to thrive on a diet that would have provided insufficient nutrition to their grassland cousins. Their feet evolved to handle the softer forest floor. The pad structure spread wider to distribute weight on leaf litter and loose soil. The toes developed additional flexibility for gripping uneven terrain between tree roots and fallen logs. This foot adaptation improved stability while moving through dense vegetation. The trunk retained its basic structure but became more precise in its movements. Fine motor control increased to select specific leaves and manipulate smaller branches. The tip developed enhanced sensitivity to distinguish between toxic and edible vegetation in the varied forest plant life. Social behavior shifted to accommodate forest living. Group sizes decreased as the habitat could not support large herds in close proximity. Family units became more independent, maintaining loose associations with other groups rather than the tight herd structures seen in plains mammoths. Communication adapted to the forest environment. Visual signals became less effective in dense vegetation, leading to increased reliance on low-frequency vocalizations that carried well through the trees. Scent marking gained importance for maintaining contact between scattered family groups. The forest mammoth brain showed enlargement in areas controlling fine motor skills and memory. These neural adaptations supported the complex manipulation required to feed in the canopy and helped them remember seasonal changes in vegetation across their territory. Their reproductive cycle aligned with forest seasonal patterns. Calving occurred during peak leaf growth when food was most abundant. Young mammoths learned complex feeding techniques from their mothers, including which tree species provided the best nutrition and how to efficiently strip bark without damaging the trunk. These forest specialists represented a successful adaptation of the mammoth lineage to woodland environments. Their modifications demonstrated the flexibility of mammoth evolution to fill diverse ecological niches beyond the stereotypical image of plains-dwelling giants. The legacy of forest mammoths persists in fossil records showing their distinct anatomical features. Their bones reveal the gradual transformation from grassland to forest adaptation through successive generations. These remains provide evidence of how environmental pressures shaped mammoth evolution in different habitats. The coastal regions became home to a distinct mammoth species that developed specialized adaptations for life along the water's edge. These mammoths exhibited unique physical characteristics that set them apart from their inland relatives, most notably their modified feet and legs. The most striking feature of these coastal mammoths was their broad, partially webbed feet. The toes spread wider than those of other mammoth species, creating a larger surface area that prevented them from sinking into soft sand and mud. Between their toes, thick skin formed flexible connections, similar to the webbing found in modern semi-aquatic mammals. This adaptation allowed them to move through shallow water with greater stability and efficiency. Their leg structure differed from other mammoth species, with slightly longer limbs and more pronounced knee joints. These modifications enabled them to lift their feet higher when walking through water, reducing resistance and conserving energy. The bones in their legs developed a more porous internal structure, making them lighter while maintaining strength, a trait that benefited their semi-aquatic lifestyle. These coastal mammoths possessed shorter, more compact bodies compared to their forest-dwelling cousins. The reduced body mass helped them stay buoyant in water and made movement through tidal zones easier. Their skin grew particularly thick and water-resistant, with a dense layer of fat beneath that provided insulation in cold coastal waters. The trunk of these water-adapted mammoths showed specialized features for feeding in aquatic environments. It maintained the typical mammoth flexibility but developed increased sensitivity and strength. These modifications allowed them to grasp and pull underwater vegetation and sift through sandy substrates for food. Small valve-like structures in their trunks prevented water from entering their airways while feeding below the surface. Their diet consisted primarily of marine vegetation, including seaweed and coastal plants. They used their trunks to gather aquatic plants from depths of up to 2 meters, though they preferred to feed in shallower waters. These mammoths also consumed land plants that grew along the shoreline, making them true amphibious feeders. The fur of coastal mammoths evolved to become more water-resistant than that of other species. The The outer layer developed oil-producing glands that helped repel water, while the undercoat remained dense and insulating. This dual-layer system protected them from both cold water and coastal winds. The fur appeared lighter in color than other mammoth species, often displaying a pale golden or sandy hue that provided camouflage against beach environments. These mammoths established distinct behavioral patterns centered around tidal cycles. They learned to time their feeding with the tides, taking advantage of low water levels to access plants that would otherwise be submerged. During high tide, they moved to higher ground or continued feeding in shallower areas. Social structures among coastal mammoths reflected their specialized habitat. They formed smaller family groups than other mammoth species, typically consisting of 3 to 8 individuals. This smaller group size allowed them to move more efficiently through coastal environments and reduced competition for resources in their limited habitat range. The breeding patterns of coastal mammoths adapted to their aquatic lifestyle. Calves were born during seasons with calmer waters and more abundant food sources. Young mammoths developed their swimming abilities early, learning to navigate shallow waters within their first few weeks of life. The mothers showed particular attention to teaching their calves how to use their trunks for underwater feeding while maintaining proper breathing control. These coastal specialists left distinct traces in the fossil record, including footprints preserved in ancient shoreline sediments. Their bones show adaptations specific to their lifestyle, with distinctive muscle attachment points that indicate powerful swimming movements. These archaeological findings help reconstruct their movement patterns and habitat preferences along prehistoric coastlines. The distribution of coastal mammoths extended along various prehistoric shorelines, with fossil evidence suggesting populations existed wherever suitable habitat combinations of shallow waters and abundant marine vegetation occurred. Their range fluctuated with changing sea levels during glacial and interglacial periods, forcing populations to adapt to shifting coastlines. The reduction in size of island-dwelling mammoth populations represents one of the most striking examples of evolutionary adaptation. This phenomenon, known as insular dwarfism, occurred across multiple Mediterranean and North American islands during the Pleistocene epoch. On California's Channel Islands, Columbian mammoths underwent significant size reduction over generations. The original mainland mammoths stood at 14 feet tall at the shoulder, but their island descendants measured just 4.5 feet, about the size of a large modern black bear. This dramatic change took place over approximately 20,000 years as the mammoths adapted to limited island resources. Similar size reductions occurred on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean, where woolly mammoths persisted until just 4,000 years ago. These mammoths decreased to about 6 feet tall at the shoulder, roughly half the size of their mainland ancestors. The smaller bodies required less food and energy to maintain, making survival possible with the island's restricted vegetation. The Mediterranean islands hosted several dwarf mammoth species during the Pleistocene. Sicily's Palaeoloxodon falconeri reached only 3 feet in height, the size of a modern baby elephant. This extreme size reduction allowed these mammoths to thrive on the limited resources available on the small island ecosystem. The process of insular dwarfism affected not just overall body size, but led to proportional changes throughout the mammoth's anatomy. Their legs became shorter and stockier, providing better stability on steep island terrain. Their tusks reduced dramatically in size, requiring less calcium and energy to grow and maintain. Brain size decreased relative to body mass, though the animals retained their complex social behaviors and intelligence. These mini mammoths developed unique feeding adaptations. Their shortened legs and compact bodies allowed them to browse low-growing vegetation efficiently. Their teeth showed modifications for processing the tough island plants available to them. Some species developed specialized grinding surfaces for breaking down fibrous plant materials found in their restricted habitats. The isolation of island populations drove these evolutionary changes through natural selection. When sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age, mainland mammoths became trapped on newly formed islands. Those individuals with genes for smaller size had an advantage in the resource-limited environment. Over generations, the population's average size decreased as smaller animals proved more successful at survival and reproduction. This evolutionary process created unique subspecies adapted specifically to island life. The Channel Islands mammoths developed distinct skeletal features, setting them apart from their mainland ancestors. Their bones showed denser internal structure, possibly an adaptation to prevent fractures on the island's rough terrain. Their feet became more compact, providing better stability on steep coastal slopes. These island-adapted mammoths maintained complex social structures despite their reduced size. Evidence suggests they lived in family groups, with adults protecting and teaching young. Their tracks indicate coordinated movement patterns, similar to those of modern elephants, suggesting they retained sophisticated communication and social learning abilities. The persistence of these dwarf mammoth populations varied by location. Some survived until relatively recent times. The Wrangel Island mammoths existed alongside early human civilizations in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Others disappeared earlier, likely due to environmental changes or human hunting pressure. Their fossils provide valuable insights into evolutionary processes and the effects of isolation on large mammals. Research continues on these remarkable examples of rapid evolutionary change. New fossil discoveries and advanced dating techniques help reconstruct the timeline of size reduction. Genetic studies reveal the mechanisms behind these anatomical changes, showing how isolation can drive dramatic adaptations in relatively short geological timeframes. The adaptation of mammoths to subterranean environments marked a significant shift in their evolution. These cave-dwelling populations developed specialized traits that enabled them to thrive in dark, enclosed spaces far from their ancestral grassland habitats. The transition began as certain mammoth groups sought shelter in extensive cave systems, likely driven by environmental pressures or predator avoidance. Over generations, their eyes enlarged and developed enhanced light-gathering capabilities, similar to those found in modern nocturnal animals. The retinal structure changed to include a higher concentration of rod cells, which excel at detecting minimal light levels. Beyond visual adaptations, these cave mammoths evolved highly sensitive whisker-like structures around their trunks. These specialized sensory organs could detect minute air currents, temperature variations, and spatial relationships in complete darkness. The sensory apparatus proved particularly useful for navigating narrow passages and avoiding obstacles in their lightless environment. Their fur underwent significant changes, becoming thinner and losing pigmentation, a common trait among cave-dwelling species. This reduction in pigmentation occurred because maintaining dark coloration required energy that served no purpose in the absence of light. The pale fur also helped other mammoths spot them in the dim cave environment, facilitating social interactions. The cave mammoth's feet developed enhanced tactile sensitivity, allowing them to detect subtle ground vibrations and changes in terrain texture. This adaptation helped them maintain stability on slippery cave floors and anticipate potential hazards. Their toe pads became larger and softer, providing better grip on wet stone surfaces. Their diet shifted to accommodate available food sources within the cave systems. They began consuming fungi, lichens, and other cave-adapted plants. Their digestive systems evolved to extract maximum nutrition from these limited food resources. Some populations developed the ability to digest unique cave-specific organisms that other mammoth species could not process. The cave environment also influenced their social structure. Living in confined spaces required new forms of communication and cooperation. They developed sophisticated touch-based social signals and low-frequency vocalizations that carried well through cave passages without creating disorienting echoes. Their trunks became more specialized for cave life, developing increased sensitivity to chemical signals. This enhanced sense of smell helped them locate food sources and identify other mammoths in their group. The trunk's musculature adapted to provide finer motor control, useful for examining cave walls and handling delicate cave flora. Brain changes accompanied these physical adaptations. The areas responsible for processing visual information decreased in size, while regions dedicated to spatial memory and touch sensitivity expanded. These neural modifications reflected their reliance on non-visual senses for survival. The cave mammoths' reproductive patterns adjusted to their environment. Birth rates decreased as the confined space and limited resources could not support large populations. Infants were born with more developed sensory systems, allowing them to adapt more quickly to the cave environment. These populations developed different circadian rhythms from their surface-dwelling relatives. Without the sun's daily cycle, their activity patterns became more flexible, determined by factors such as food availability and group dynamics rather than light levels. Their immune systems adapted to the unique challenges of cave life, developing resistance to fungi and bacteria common in underground environments. This biological defense system proved crucial for survival in the humid, enclosed cave atmosphere. The cave mammoth's success in adapting to subterranean life demonstrated the remarkable plasticity of mammoth evolution. These adaptations created distinct populations specialized for life in darkness, representing a dramatic departure from the open plains lifestyle of their ancestors. The tundra mammoths adapted to life in the open Arctic plains, developing traits distinct from their cave-dwelling relatives. These specimens grew leaner bodies with longer legs, enabling rapid movement across the frozen landscape. Their muscular builds reflected the demands of pursuing prey through snow and ice, marking a significant departure from the bulkier frame of their ancestors. These Arctic populations formed tight-knit hunting groups, typically consisting of 8 to 12 adults. The social structure centered on coordinated pursuit strategies, with different members taking specific roles during hunts. Lead runners positioned themselves at the front, tracking prey movement and directing the group's course. Flanking members maintained parallel paths, ready to intercept prey that attempted lateral escapes. The fur of Arctic mammoths underwent substantial changes, becoming shorter and denser than that of other mammoth species. This adaptation reduced drag during high-speed pursuits while maintaining effective insulation against extreme cold. Their coat developed a two-layer system, a protective outer layer that sheds snow and ice, plus an inner layer that trapped warm air close to the skin. These mammals displayed remarkable stamina, capable of sustained runs lasting several hours. Their cardiovascular system adapted to process oxygen more efficiently in the thin, cold air of high latitudes. Large lung capacity combined with specialized blood vessels near the skin's surface helped regulate body temperature during intense physical activity. The Arctic runners developed unique foot structures with broad, padded soles that distributed weight across snow and ice. These adaptations prevented them from breaking through frozen surfaces and provided superior traction. Their toes spread wider than other mammoth species, acting like natural snowshoes. Communication between pack members evolved through a combination of low-frequency vocalizations and body positioning. These signals carried effectively across open terrain, allowing groups to coordinate movements without breaking stride. The mammoths used specific calls to indicate prey location, terrain hazards, and directional changes. Their hunting patterns followed seasonal migrations of prey species, particularly Arctic deer and wild cattle. The mammoths learned to predict these movements based on weather patterns and available vegetation. They established regular hunting circuits that could span hundreds of miles, returning to productive areas as prey populations recovered. The Arctic runners modified their trunk structure, developing a more streamlined form that reduced wind resistance during pursuit. This adaptation allowed them to maintain higher speeds while expending less energy. The trunk retained full dexterity for food gathering, but could be held close to the body during runs. These mammoths exhibited sophisticated group tactics when confronting larger prey. They practiced coordinated approaches from multiple angles, using their combined mass to overwhelm larger animals. The hunting groups showed advanced problem-solving abilities, adapting their strategies based on terrain features and prey behavior. Their social bonds extended beyond hunting activities. The groups maintained strong familial connections, with multiple generations working together. Young mammoths learn hunting skills through observation and supervised participation, starting with smaller prey before advancing to more challenging targets. The Arctic runners developed specialized fat storage patterns that concentrated insulating layers where needed most while maintaining an aerodynamic form. This selective distribution allowed them to survive seasonal food shortages without compromising their hunting efficiency. Their metabolism adjusted to maximize energy extraction from limited plant resources during winter months. These adaptations created a highly successful subspecies that dominated the Arctic ecological niche for thousands of years. Their presence shaped the behavior of prey species and influenced the distribution of plant life across the tundra. The Arctic runners represented a unique evolutionary response to the challenges of high-latitude survival, combining social cooperation with physical adaptation. The warm, nutrient-rich swamps of the late Pleistocene era supported specialized proboscideans who developed unique feeding strategies. These elephantine creatures, distinct from their mammoth cousins, possessed elongated trunks adapted for extracting sustenance from murky waters and thick mud. The most notable of these swamp-dwelling proboscideans belonged to the genus Comphitherium, which inhabited wetland environments across multiple continents. Their trunks, approximately 25% longer than those of modern elephants, contained specialized muscles and sensory organs that allowed them to detect food sources beneath the water's surface. These adaptations enabled them to filter feed effectively, separating edible matter from mud and debris. These animals developed shovel-like lower jaws that worked in conjunction with their trunks, creating an efficient system for processing swamp vegetation. The lower tusks, flat and broad, acted as scoops that could dig through soft sediments, while the trunk filtered water through specialized bristles. This feeding method extracted algae, aquatic plants, and small organisms from the muddy waters. The social structure of swamp feeders differed from that of their tundra-dwelling relatives. Rather than forming large herds, they gathered in smaller family groups of 4 to 8 individuals. This arrangement proved more practical for feeding in wetland environments, where resources were concentrated but required careful extraction. The smaller groups moved between productive feeding areas, following seasonal changes in water levels and plant growth. Their feet evolved specialized padding that prevented them from sinking too deeply into soft substrates. Wide, splayed toes distributed their weight effectively across unstable ground, allowing them to access food sources that other large herbivores could not reach. This adaptation gave them exclusive access to certain feeding zones within their habitat. The dental structure of swamp feeders reflected their specialized diet. Their molars developed complex ridges that efficiently processed fibrous aquatic vegetation. Unlike the high-crowned teeth of mammoths adapted for grinding tough grasses, these proboscideans had lower-crowned teeth suited for crushing softer, water-rich plants. Their digestive systems adapted to process large quantities of water along with their food. Special compounds in their stomachs helped break down potentially harmful bacteria and algae that they inevitably consumed while filter feeding. This biological innovation allowed them to thrive in environments that might have proved challenging for other herbivores. The swamp feeders developed distinct seasonal behaviors. During drier periods, they would concentrate their feeding activities in permanent water bodies, using their trunks to reach deeper into the remaining wet areas. In wetter seasons, they dispersed across broader territories, taking advantage of newly flooded areas rich in fresh growth. These animals played a significant role in their ecosystem by maintaining open waterways through their feeding activities. Their movement through swamps created channels that other species used, and their feeding habits prevented the overgrowth of certain aquatic plants. This environmental modification benefited numerous other species that shared their habitat. Communication among swamp feeders relied heavily on low-frequency sounds that traveled effectively through water and soft ground. These vocalizations helped maintain group cohesion in densely vegetated areas where visual contact might be limited. The sounds could travel for several kilometers through the water, allowing separated groups to maintain contact. The reproductive patterns of these proboscideans adapted to the seasonal nature of their wetland habitats. Cows were typically born at the start of the wet season when food resources were most abundant. Young animals learned the complex filtering techniques from their mothers and other family members, developing the skills necessary for efficient feeding in their challenging environment. These remarkable creatures represented a unique evolutionary response to the opportunities presented by swamp environments. Their specialized adaptations demonstrated the diversity of feeding strategies that evolved within the proboscidean family, highlighting how different environmental pressures led to distinct solutions for survival. The flat-headed mammoths represented a distinct adaptation to life on the open grasslands of North America during the Pleistocene epoch. These massive herbivores developed specialized physical features that set them apart from other mammoth species and enabled them to thrive in prairie environments. The skull structure of flat-headed mammoths showed clear modifications for grazing. Their cranial profile displayed a distinctly flattened forehead, which altered the angle at which they held their heads while feeding. This positioning allowed them to crop grass more efficiently at ground level, similar to modern bison. Their teeth evolved parallel adaptations, high-crowned molars with numerous enamel ridges that could withstand the intense wear from silica-rich prairie grasses. These mammoths possessed shorter tusks compared to their woolly mammoth relatives, reducing the energy costs of carrying excessive tusk weight while covering large distances between feeding grounds. The shortened tusks still prove useful for scraping snow off vegetation during winter months, but required less physical maintenance and calcium investment from the animal. Their body proportions reflected the demands of prairie life. Strong, sturdy legs supported their massive frame across the open terrain, while their shoulder height reached up to 14 feet in adult males. Their overall build favored endurance over pure power, enabling them to traverse extensive grassland territories in search of optimal feeding areas as seasonal conditions changed. The digestive system of flat-headed mammoths processed prairie vegetation with remarkable efficiency. Their enlarged cecum and specialized gut bacteria broke down tough grass fibers, extracting maximum nutritional value from what might seem like sparse food resources. This internal adaptation proved critical for survival in environments where food quality could vary dramatically between seasons. Social behavior patterns emerged in response to prairie living conditions. Flat-headed mammoths formed loose herds that moved together across the grasslands, providing mutual protection from predators while preventing overgrazing in any single area. This movement pattern helped maintain prairie ecosystem health through grazing pressure that stimulated new plant growth. The seasonal cycles of prairie environments shaped their annual patterns. During summer months, these mammoths spread out across the grasslands, taking advantage of abundant vegetation. Winter conditions forced them to concentrate in areas where wind exposure kept snow cover minimal, allowing access to the grass beneath. This seasonal adaptation required both physical stamina and social flexibility. Their impact on prairie ecosystems extended beyond simple grass consumption. Through their movement and feeding patterns, flat-headed mammoths created and maintained grazing lawns, areas of short, nutritious grass that benefited other herbivorous species. Their dung fertilized the soil, while their heavy footfalls helped compress and maintain the prairie soil structure. Evidence suggests these mammoths developed complex migration routes across the North American prairies. Fossil trackways indicate regular movement patterns between seasonal feeding grounds, with herds following established paths that connected reliable water sources and prime grazing areas. These routes became biological corridors that other species utilized. The extinction of flat-headed mammoths altered prairie ecosystems significantly. Their absence changed vegetation patterns and affected soil composition as their grazing and fertilization roles disappeared. Modern prairie environments still show traces of their influence in plant communities adapted to large herbivore grazing pressure. Research continues to reveal new details about how these specialized grazers adapted to prairie life. Isotope analysis of preserved tusks provides information about their seasonal dietary changes, while studies of foot bone structure offer insights into their movement patterns across different terrain types. Each discovery adds depth to our knowledge of these remarkable prairie specialists. The dense tropical forests presented unique challenges for mammoth populations that migrated into these lush environments. Through natural selection over generations, certain mammoth groups developed specialized adaptations for life among the steep slopes and thick vegetation. These forest-dwelling mammoths evolved distinct physical characteristics that set them apart from their grassland relatives. Their feet underwent significant modifications, developing flexible ankle joints and spreading toes that provided better grip on uneven terrain. The soles of their feet became more padded and textured, allowing them to maintain stability on wet, mossy surfaces common in tropical forests. Their bodies became more compact compared to other mammoth species, with shorter legs and a lower center of gravity that aided in traversing narrow paths between trees. The reduced body mass helped them move through dense undergrowth without getting trapped or losing balance on precarious inclines. The trunk of these forest mammoths showed remarkable adaptations. It became more muscular and agile, capable of grasping branches and vines for additional support during climbs. The tip developed enhanced sensitivity and dexterity, useful for finding secure handholds in the dark forest understory. Their tusks underwent notable changes too. Rather than the long, curved tusks of their plains-dwelling cousins, forest mammoths developed shorter, straighter tusks. This modification prevented them from getting tangled in vines and branches, making it easier to push through thick vegetation. The forest mammoth's social structure adapted to their environment. Living in smaller family groups rather than large herds, they could better manage the limited resources available in their forest habitat. These smaller groups moved efficiently through the undergrowth, following established paths worn into the mountainsides. Their diet shifted to accommodate available forest vegetation. Strong grinding teeth processed tough leaves and bark, while their trunks became skilled at picking fruits and tender shoots from high branches. This dietary flexibility allowed them to thrive in areas where grasses were scarce. The mammoth's skin developed increased resistance to moisture, protecting them from the constant humidity of their rainforest home. Their fur became shorter and more water-resistant, preventing fungal growth and reducing the risk of skin infections common in wet environments. These adaptations led to successful colonization of tropical forest environments across several regions. Fossil evidence shows their presence in mountainous rainforests, where they created networks of trails that other animals used. Their impact on forest ecosystems included seed dispersal and vegetation management, contributing to forest diversity. The forest mammoth's success demonstrated the remarkable adaptability of the mammoth lineage. From their origins as plains-dwelling giants, these populations transformed into agile forest dwellers, proving that even the largest land mammals could adapt to life in challenging forest environments. Research continues to uncover new details about these forest-adapted mammoths. Each fossil discovery adds to the understanding of their physical capabilities and ecological roles. The variations in foot structure, trunk anatomy, and tusk shape provide clear evidence of their specialized adaptations to forest life. These modifications represent a significant evolutionary shift from their grassland ancestors. The transition from flat terrain to steep slopes required fundamental changes in locomotion, feeding strategies, and social behavior. The forest mammoths stand as an example of nature's capacity for dramatic transformation through natural selection. The vast salt plains presented unique challenges for mammoths, yet certain populations adapted to thrive in these mineral-rich environments. These specialized mammoths developed physiological modifications that allowed them to process vegetation with high salt content, setting them apart from their relatives in other regions. The salt plain mammoths possessed enhanced kidney functions that efficiently filtered excess minerals from their bloodstream. Their bodies maintained precise electrolyte balance through modified cell membrane proteins, which regulated sodium and potassium levels. This adaptation prevented toxic buildup of minerals that would harm other mammals consuming the same vegetation. These mammoths developed thicker enamel on their teeth, resistant to the abrasive effects of salt-crusted plants. The dental adaptations extended to specialized ridges that could better process the tough, mineral-laden vegetation common in salt plain environments. Their molars showed distinct wear patterns that indicated regular consumption of plants with high silica and salt content. The digestive system of salt plain mammoths underwent significant changes. Their stomachs produced additional enzymes that broke down salt-resistant plant cells, extracting maximum nutrition from the limited vegetation options. The intestinal tract evolved to absorb water more efficiently, preventing dehydration in the mineral-rich environment. These mammoths developed specialized behaviors to manage their salt intake. They learned to identify and select plants with balanced mineral content, avoiding those with dangerous salt levels. They established regular migration patterns between areas of high and low salt concentration, maintaining optimal mineral consumption throughout the year. The salt plain mammoth's skin adapted to protect against the harsh effects of mineral exposure. Their hide became less permeable, reducing water loss through evaporation and preventing excess salt absorption through the skin. The texture of their fur changed to repel salt crystals that accumulated during dust storms. These populations developed larger liver structures that processed minerals more effectively than their counterparts in other environments. The enhanced organ function allowed them to detoxify potentially harmful compounds found in salt-adapted vegetation. Their metabolic processes evolved to require less water, reducing the strain of living in areas where fresh water sources were limited. The social structure of salt plain mammoths reflected their specialized habitat. Herds maintained smaller numbers than those in more fertile regions, reducing competition for limited resources. They developed communication systems that helped locate and share information about safe water sources and optimal feeding grounds. Their feet adapted to the crusty, mineral-hardened ground of the salt plains. The pad structure became more resistant to chemical irritation from constant contact with salt-laden soil. Their walking patterns shifted to distribute weight more evenly, preventing damage to their feet from prolonged exposure to corrosive minerals. These mammoths exhibited changes in their blood composition with modified hemoglobin that functioned efficiently despite high mineral concentrations. Their cardiovascular system adapted to maintain stable blood pressure despite the challenges of processing mineral-rich nutrients and water. The success of salt plain mammoths demonstrated the remarkable adaptability of these prehistoric creatures. Their specialized traits allowed them to exploit environments that other large herbivores found uninhabitable, creating unique populations that thrived in challenging conditions. Research continues to reveal new details about how these mammoths managed life in mineral-rich environments. Fossil evidence shows gradual changes in bone density and composition, indicating multi-generational adaptation to high salt conditions. These findings provide insights into how large mammals can adapt to extreme environmental conditions over time. The salt plain mammoth populations serve as examples of successful adaptation to challenging environments. Their specialized traits enabled survival in conditions that would prove fatal to other mammoth species, highlighting the diversity of mammoth adaptations across different habitats. Mountain-adapted mammoths developed distinct physical traits that enabled them to traverse narrow ridges and steep slopes with precision. These mammoths exhibited shorter legs compared to their plains-dwelling relatives, providing a lower center of gravity that increased stability on precarious terrain. Their feet featured modified toe pads with enhanced grip, allowing secure footing on rocky surfaces and preventing slips on loose scree. The skeletal structure of ridge-running mammoths showed notable adaptations, including more flexible ankle joints and specialized knee articulation that facilitated careful placement of each foot. Their spines demonstrated greater lateral flexibility, enabling them to maintain balance while maneuverting through tight passages between rock faces. These modifications resulted from generations of natural selection in mountainous environments. Ridge runners possessed unique behavioral patterns that set them apart from other mammoth species. They moved in smaller family groups of 3 to 5 individuals, rather than the larger herds common to plains mammoths. This social structure proved advantageous in mountain environments, where resources were often scattered and paths could accommodate only a few animals at once. These mammoths developed sophisticated spatial awareness, demonstrated by their ability to judge gap widths between rocks and assess whether their body size would allow passage. They learned to test potentially unstable rocks before committing their full weight, reducing the risk of accidents on treacherous slopes. Their trunks served as additional balance tools, pressing against rock faces for support during particularly challenging sections. The diet of ridge runners consisted primarily of high-altitude vegetation, including hardy grasses, lichens, and small woody plants that grew in the thin soil of mountain environments. Their teeth showed adaptations for processing these tough plant materials, with modified enamel patterns that increased grinding efficiency. They developed the ability to extract nutrients from less abundant food sources, making them well-suited to the sparse vegetation of their mountain habitat. Ridge runners established regular routes through their territory, creating networks of paths that connected feeding grounds, water sources, and sheltered resting areas. These paths often followed natural contours in the landscape, taking advantage of stable rock formations and avoiding areas prone to landslides or rockfalls. Young mammoths learned these routes from older family members, preserving knowledge of safe passages across generations. The species demonstrated remarkable problem-solving abilities when confronted with obstacles. If a traditional path became blocked by fallen rocks or snow, ridge runners could assess alternative routes and make informed decisions about the safest way forward. This cognitive flexibility proved essential for survival in an environment where conditions changed frequently due to weather and geological activity. During winter months, ridge runners employed specific strategies to cope with harsh conditions. They utilized their trunks to clear snow from vegetation and developed techniques for breaking through ice to access water. Their thick fur provided insulation against cold mountain winds, while their compact body shape minimized heat loss. The social dynamics of ridge runner groups centered around cooperative behaviors that enhanced survival. Adults worked together to protect young mammoths during dangerous crossings, positioning themselves strategically to prevent falls and guide inexperienced individuals. This collaborative approach to navigation reflected the challenges of their mountain habitat and the importance of group learning in mastering difficult terrain. Ridge runners established territories that spanned different elevation zones, allowing them to respond to seasonal changes in resource availability. They moved to higher elevations during summer months when vegetation was abundant and descended to more sheltered areas during winter. This vertical migration pattern required detailed knowledge of multiple routes and the ability to adapt to varying conditions at different altitudes. The success of ridge runners in mountain environments demonstrated the remarkable adaptability of mammoth species. Through physical evolution and behavioral adaptation, these animals transformed the challenges of mountainous terrain into advantages, creating a sustainable niche in one of Earth's most demanding habitats. Mammoths adapted to aquatic environments through remarkable physical modifications that enabled them to thrive in frigid waters. These adaptations included thick layers of insulating blubber beneath their skin, similar to modern marine mammals like whales and seals. The blubber served multiple functions beyond temperature regulation. It provided buoyancy control and energy storage. The aquatic mammoths developed specialized respiratory systems that allowed for extended periods underwater. Their trunks evolved into natural snorkels, with specialized valve structures preventing water intake during submersion. This adaptation let them feed on underwater vegetation while keeping their bodies submerged in the relative warmth of deeper waters. These marine-adapted mammoths possessed larger, broader feet that functioned like flippers when swimming. The modified appendages generated powerful propulsion through the water while maintaining the ability to walk effectively on land. Their dense fur trapped air bubbles close to the skin, creating an additional insulating layer that protected against heat loss in cold waters. The blubber accumulation process occurred seasonally, with the mammals building up thick layers during periods of abundant food availability. This fat storage system proved critical for survival during leaner seasons, when food sources became scarce. The insulating properties of blubber maintained core body temperatures even in near-freezing waters. These swimming mammoths developed social behaviors centered around aquatic activities. Groups coordinated their movements in the water, often swimming in formation to reduce energy expenditure. Young calves stayed close to their mothers, learning essential swimming techniques and feeding strategies through observation and practice. Their diet expanded to include aquatic plants found in lakes, rivers, and coastal areas. The mammoths used their trunks to grasp and pull vegetation from underwater, bringing it to the surface for consumption. This feeding strategy gave them access to food sources unavailable to strictly terrestrial herbivores. The skull structure of aquatic mammoths showed modifications that facilitated underwater feeding. The angle and musculature of their necks allowed for efficient underwater grazing while maintaining awareness of their surroundings. Their eyes developed protective membranes similar to those found in seals, enabling clear vision both above and below the water's surface. These mammals exhibited distinct seasonal migration patterns, following food sources along waterways and coastlines. They moved between feeding grounds based on water temperature and plant availability, establishing regular routes that supported their nutritional needs throughout the year. The swimming adaptations of these mammoths influenced their social structure. Groups gathered in sheltered bays and coves, creating communal areas for rest and social interaction. These locations offered protection from strong currents and predators while allowing easy access to feeding grounds. Their communication methods adapted to include underwater vocalizations that carried effectively through water. These sounds supplemented their existing repertoire of trunk calls and body language, enabling coordination during group swimming and feeding activities. The development of swimming abilities affected their defensive strategies. When threatened, these mammoths could retreat into deeper waters where most predators could not follow. This aquatic escape route provided an additional layer of security beyond traditional defensive behaviors. Research suggests these adaptations developed gradually over numerous generations as populations spent increasing amounts of time in aquatic environments. The successful traits passed to offspring, creating specialized populations of swimming mammoths adapted to life both on land and in water. High in the mountain ranges, a distinct species of mammoth developed remarkable adaptations for life among the peaks and cliffs. These mountain-dwelling mammoths evolved hollow, lightweight bones and broad, flat feet that distributed their weight across rocky surfaces. Their most striking feature became the stretches of skin extending between their legs, creating natural membranes that enabled controlled gliding between mountain faces. The skeletal structure of these aerial mammoths underwent significant modifications compared to their ground-dwelling relatives. Their bones contained numerous air pockets, similar to those found in modern birds, reducing their overall mass while maintaining structural integrity. This adaptation proved critical for achieving lift during their gliding movements. The skin membranes, or patagia, stretched from their front legs to their back legs, creating wing-like surfaces that caught air currents. These membranes consisted of highly elastic tissue reinforced with collagen fibers, allowing them to extend and contract as needed during gliding sequences. When not in use, the membranes folded close to the body, preventing interference with regular movement across terrain. These mammoths developed precise control over their membrane deployment through specialized muscles along their sides. By tensing or relaxing these muscles, they adjusted the shape and angle of their gliding surfaces, enabling them to control their descent paths and maximize their gliding distance. Their trunks evolved into aerodynamic tools, becoming slightly flattened and more rigid. During glides, they held their trunks straight ahead, using them as natural rudders to assist with steering. The tip retained its grasping ability, essential for securing food from cliff faces and anchoring themselves upon landing. Their fur adapted to high-altitude conditions, becoming shorter and more densely packed to reduce air resistance during glides, while maintaining adequate insulation against mountain temperatures. The fur pattern created natural airflow channels, improving their aerodynamic efficiency. Mountain mammoth herds developed sophisticated social behaviors centered around their gliding abilities. They established regular gliding routes between peaks, using thermal updrafts and predictable wind patterns to conserve energy during transit. These routes connected various feeding grounds and seasonal territories across mountain ranges. The species displayed remarkable spatial awareness and weather reading abilities. They learned to interpret cloud formations, wind directions, and atmospheric pressure changes that indicated favorable gliding conditions. This knowledge passed from adults to young through observed behavior and guided practice sessions. Young mountain mammoths began their gliding education early, starting with short hops between small ridges under close adult supervision. As their skills and confidence grew, they progressed to longer glides, eventually joining adults in full mountain-to-mountain transits. Their feeding habits adapted to their mountain lifestyle, focusing on high-altitude vegetation growing on cliff faces and steep slopes. Their ability to glide allowed them to access food sources unreachable by other herbivores, reducing competition and establishing a unique ecological niche. The species developed specialized landing techniques using their broad, padded feet to absorb impact. Their feet contained shock-absorbing tissue and flexible toe arrangements that helped them grip various surface textures upon touchdown. These adaptations prevented injury during landing and enabled quick transitions to walking or climbing. Their social structure centered around small family groups that shared common gliding territories. These groups coordinated their movements, often gliding in formation to benefit from shared air currents and maintain visual contact during long-distance transits between peaks. The mountain mammoths' unique adaptations extended to their sensory capabilities. Their eyes developed enhanced depth perception and peripheral vision, critical for judging distances and identifying landing zones during glides. Their inner ears evolved sophisticated balance mechanisms that helped maintain stability during aerial maneuvers. These adaptations created a highly specialized species perfectly suited to life in mountainous regions. Their ability to glide between peaks revolutionized their approach to resource gathering, predator avoidance, and social interaction, establishing them as masters of their high-altitude domain. The success of these mountain mammoths demonstrated the remarkable adaptability of the mammoth lineage. Their transformation from ground-dwelling giants to aerial mountain specialists represented a unique evolutionary response to the challenges and opportunities presented by their mountain environment. The mammoths' role in forest ecology extended far beyond their physical presence, creating lasting impacts through their dietary habits and movement patterns. These massive herbivores acted as primary seed dispersal agents, transporting plant material across vast distances through their digestive systems. Adult mammoths consumed between 180 to 350 kilograms of vegetation daily, including substantial quantities of fruits, berries, and other seed-bearing plants. The seeds passed through their digestive tracts intact, benefiting from both the mechanical scarification process and the nutrient-rich dung that encased them upon excretion. This natural fertilization system gave seeds optimal conditions for germination and early growth. The mammoth's digestive process took approximately 18 hours, during which time these animals could travel significant distances. Research indicates that seeds could be transported 20 to 50 kilometers from their origin points, allowing plant species to colonize new territories and maintain genetic diversity across populations. This long-distance dispersal proved particularly significant during periods of climate change, enabling plants to track shifting environmental conditions. Different mammoth species showed preferences for specific fruit types, creating varied patterns of forest composition. The larger species targeted bigger fruits with larger seeds, while smaller mammoth varieties focused on smaller berries and fruits. This size-based selection pressure influenced the evolution of fruit-bearing plants, with some species developing specific traits that made them more attractive to mammoth consumption. The mammoth dung itself created microhabitats that supported numerous other species. The partially digested plant material provided food for insects and small mammals, which in turn attracted birds and other predators. These dung piles became nodes of biodiversity, supporting complex food webs and ecological interactions. Seasonal migration patterns of mammoth herds established regular seed dispersal corridors. These corridors became zones of increased plant diversity as seeds from different regions mixed and established themselves along the migration routes. Modern studies of fossil plant distributions often reveal these ancient mammoth highways through unusual combinations of plant species that would typically grow in separate regions. The loss of mammoths as seed dispersers had profound effects on plant communities. Many plant species that evolved alongside mammoths faced reproductive challenges without their primary dispersal agents. Some adapted by developing alternative dispersal mechanisms, while others became restricted to smaller geographic ranges or went extinct. Several plant species today exhibit characteristics that suggest adaptation to mammoth dispersal, such as large fruits that drop and rot on the ground rather than being dispersed by existing animals. Modern elephants demonstrate similar seed dispersal behaviors, offering insights into how mammoths might have influenced their environments. Studies show that African forest elephants disperse seeds from over 350 tree species, with some seeds only germinating successfully after passing through an elephant's digestive system. This parallel helps scientists reconstruct the ecological roles of extinct mammoth species. The timing of mammoth feeding patterns affected forest composition. These animals fed continuously throughout the day and night, moving between different feeding areas. This constant movement pattern meant that seeds were deposited across varied environmental conditions, increasing the likelihood of successful establishment in suitable habitats. The mammoths' seed dispersal activities created a mosaic of plant communities. Their selective feeding habits, combined with their movement patterns, maintained open areas within forests and created edges and transitions between different vegetation types. This habitat heterogeneity supported greater biodiversity by providing various niches for other species. Research continues to uncover new aspects of mammoth-plant interactions through studies of preserved dung specimens, dental wear patterns, and plant microfossils trapped in sediments. These investigations reveal complex relationships between mammoths and their food plants, suggesting that these animals played key roles in maintaining ecosystem stability and promoting plant species diversity across their range. The Columbian and woolly mammoths developed distinct feeding behaviors that set them apart from other Ice Age herbivores. Their exceptional height allowed them to access food sources far beyond the reach of most other animals, creating a unique ecological niche in the Pleistocene landscape. Standing at heights of up to 14 feet at the shoulder, these massive proboscideans could extend their reach even further using their trunks. This adaptation enabled them to browse vegetation at heights of 20 feet or more, accessing fresh growth and tender leaves in the upper canopy layers of trees. Their specialized trunk anatomy, combined with their impressive stature, made them the only large herbivores capable of regular feeding at such elevations. The mammoth's feeding strategy differed significantly from that of modern elephants. While present-day elephants primarily feed at lower levels, mammoths evolved to exploit the full vertical range of available vegetation. Their dental structures showed adaptations for processing both low-growing vegetation and woody materials from higher branches, indicating a varied diet that spanned multiple vegetation zones. These feeding patterns left distinct traces in the prehistoric environment. Trees in mammoth-inhabited regions often displayed evidence of browsing at heights unreachable by other herbivores. The regular pruning of upper branches by mammoths influenced tree growth patterns and forest structure, creating more open canopies that allowed light to reach the forest floor. The ability to access high vegetation proved particularly valuable during seasonal changes. When ground-level vegetation became scarce during harsh winters or dry periods, mammoths could sustain themselves on food sources unavailable to other herbivores. This adaptation helped them survive in varied environments and may have contributed to their widespread distribution across North America. Mammoth trunk anatomy played a critical role in their feeding success. The long, flexible appendage contained thousands of muscles and possessed both strength and precision. This allowed them to strip bark from trees, pluck individual leaves, and break substantial branches. The trunk's length enabled them to reach around obstacles and access food from angles that would have been impossible for other browsing animals. Their height-based feeding strategy also affected their social behavior. Adult mammoths often fed in loose groups, spacing themselves to avoid competition for the same upper canopy resources. Young mammoths learned these specialized feeding techniques from older herd members, developing the skills needed to exploit high vegetation sources effectively. The mammoth's role as high-level browsers had cascading effects throughout their ecosystems. Their feeding activities created light gaps in the forest canopy, promoting the growth of sun-loving plants below. This process helped maintain a diverse vegetative structure that benefited many other species, from ground-dwelling herbs to middle canopy shrubs. Research into mammoth feeding habits has revealed evidence of their browse lines in preserved tree remains. These ancient traces show consistent patterns of branch removal and bark stripping at heights matching the reach of adult mammoths. Such archaeological evidence helps scientists reconstruct the feeding behaviors and ecological impacts of these extinct megaherbivores. The unique feeding adaptations of mammoths represented a specialized form of resource partitioning in Pleistocene ecosystems. By accessing food sources beyond the reach of other herbivores, they reduced competition and established themselves as distinctive members of their biological communities. This specialization likely contributed to their success across varied landscapes and climatic conditions during their long reign in North America. Their role as high-level browsers ended with their extinction, leaving a gap in ecosystem dynamics that remains unfilled. Modern forests lack megaherbivores capable of reaching such heights, resulting in different patterns of canopy development and forest structure compared to Pleistocene landscapes. The loss of these skygrazers marked a significant shift in North American forest ecology, demonstrating the lasting impact of their unique feeding adaptations.